Following last week's Bardsung unboxing, we'll be going through the Bardsung Legend of the Ancient Forge review, as well as the 3 things we liked and the 3 things we didn't like about the game. There's a lot to talk about this game, but I will start by saying this. It feels familiar in a lot of ways to some of the critically acclaimed dungeon crawl board games, but some things hold the game's potential from being great. My name is Nick, and we are Tabletop Duo. Thanks for joining us. We make how-to-play videos, unboxing and reviews of your favorite board games. And if you're new to our channel, consider subscribing to get our weekly videos and hit the notification button so you can get an update whenever a new video goes live. Bardsung is the latest board game from Steamforged Games, the creators of Dark Souls and Resident Evil board games, and they did a Kickstarter campaign last year on this new original IP. The game came out a few weeks ago and became finally available in Canada. So let's start our review by talking about the base game components. The game comes with a big box full of miniatures to a total of 68 of them. It comes with a big board that's double-sided, where one side you're going to be using to fight the regular encounters and the other one is used on boss fights. There is a large variety of tiles from all sizes which are used to build the encounters. More than 900 cards that range from enemy behaviors, enemy stats cards, corridor and room cards, treasure cards and narrative cards. You also have an assortment of die with 2d20, 1d12, 1d8, 3d6 and 2d4. And you also have a rule book and an adventure book which will be used to guide you through the game's story. And finally, you also have cards and tokens for 5 unique heroes and an insert to store their tokens. If you have not watched the unboxing, just click on the link above or you can find it at the video's description. Now that we went through the game components, let me talk about the gameplay. You start by choosing a hero. You have 5 heroes that you can choose from, and you can play the game from 1 to 5 players. Each hero has their own set of abilities, which are divided into active abilities, which you need to play in order for them to happen, or passive abilities, which trigger once the condition happened during combat. Heroes have also 6 attributes, which can be used during combat or during specific events by adding bonus values to the action rolls. The attributes are Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma, which will be very familiar if you are into RPG games. Your heroes will go on a journey to uncover the mysteries of the Ancient Forge, and to do so, you're using the adventure book. The book will tell you the narrative of the game, and then give you options towards your journey, which will bring you to different chapters of the game. So you have the flexibility on how you want to proceed with your party. Each chapter is composed of a group of encounters that need to be played according to the diagram of the chapter. Encounters will have different objectives and you may have treasures and some extra narrative as you're going through them. Some paths will also be locked, requiring players to complete certain encounters before doing the locked one, which seems familiar to the Resident Evil 3 board game from Steamforged Games. The way you set up the encounters is also really interesting. You have 2 decks, a room deck and a corridor deck, and from the start tile, you explore by drawing a corridor card when you are in a room or drawing a room card when you are in a corridor. The card will indicate if the room or corridor will have enemies, and the enemy types are written on the chapter that you are playing. Depending on how many players are playing the chapter, the game adjusts the difficulty by adding more enemies. Then, you check the card's lower right and draw a random event card from the corresponding deck. They might ask you to perform an action roll, give stats buffs or debuffs to enemies, or give you narrative bits. Like I mentioned before, each encounter will have a different objective. Some encounters will ask you to reach one of the edges of the board, some will have specific setups, and others will require you to go from left to right and so on. Talking about encounters, let's go through the combat, which is one of the more important elements in the game. You start by shuffling the initiative cards of the heroes and enemies, and that will give you the initiative order. Starting from left to right, each character and enemy will perform their behaviors. To hit the enemy, the hero throws a d20 and compare it with the results of the enemy's target number. If you get the exact number or higher, you hit the enemy. Then you roll a damage die. Some heroes use a d4, some a d6, and so on. You compare the roll with the enemy's toughness. If the number is lower, it's a hit. So you look at your active abilities card and you deal the damage described in it. If you roll a higher or equal number than the toughness value, you will do a critical hit. So you apply the damaging effects based on the critical section of the abilities card. When an enemy receives 2 damage, you look at the grid section and you do what it says. Most basic enemies will die after receiving 2 damage, while others ask you to flip the card, bringing them to heat up state, which changes the damage and the target number. If you do 2 or more damage when an enemy is on heat up, the enemy is defeated. You also have an assortment of tokens which help you revive characters if they die, or allow you to access secret doors as you explore dungeons, or allow you to cast powerful abilities. And that's a summary of what you get when you play the game. So let me talk a little bit about our thoughts in the game, and also go through the 3 things we liked and the 3 things we didn't like about the game. Bardsung's exploration is quite unique by the fact that each dungeon is built by the players, and the more you advance on the campaign, the more events are added to the events deck, which increase the chances that each room you will go will have unique variations because of the enemy composition and the event randomness. That would be pretty cool if it were not for 2 things that we saw that create some noise on the exploration. The first one being the fact that it's very hard to understand the spaces inside the tile, and that's because of the art direction. We would often stop to try to understand the boundaries of the spaces within the tiles. The game comes with a reference sheet where you can see the division of the tiles, and I really wanted that the lines between the spaces to be more like what you get on the reference sheet. The second problem is that the random event cards gradually build up as you complete the chapters. But in the beginning, there's not a lot of variation, and you will be seeing the same events happening all the time. Games like Gloomhaven also have the same concept for city and road events, but the variety at the beginning is bigger, and a lot of those cards get removed as you play them, which makes repetition less of a thing. The combat in the game is pretty cool, and I think the characters play a big part of it, because they're very unique in terms of abilities and how they play. For example, the Night Feather is an assassin, and it's all about moving around the tiles and pushing enemies towards them as they deal damage. The Wild Shell is all about using ghost lights and combos that weaken enemies, increase the character damage dice roll, and deal more damage. You can upgrade your character abilities by spending XP, which is gained at the end of an encounter, or by fulfilling specific objectives. Upgrade versions of the abilities are pretty cool, and you really feel more powerful when you upgrade them. You can also buy new abilities from your hero or also from other heroes, deeply customizing them. Learning abilities from other heroes is more costly though. You can also upgrade your stats, and during specific moments of the campaign, you might also upgrade your weapons. That's all great, and we had a good time upgrading and playing with our characters. Storing them is also really easy because it uses game trace inserts that are really good, and they lock the contents inside so that they will be in place when you play the next game. The part that's not so interesting about the combat is the fact that within the same chapter, you will be facing the same enemies for 5 or 6 dungeons in a row, and each dungeon takes around an hour or so, depending on the number of players. So you could be fighting for 5 hours, sometimes 6, without seeing any variation whatsoever in the enemy composition. They tried adding random encounters during the dungeon to solve this problem, but I think it doesn't work really well and seems more like a gimmick. Boss fights are also super cool, because they have a series of attacks, and each attack is shuffled on the initiative order. Like regular enemies, bosses don't have a direct health system. Instead, when you do damage to the boss, you flip one of the boss attack cards to the heat up phase. When all attack cards are flipped to the heat up, if you do 2 more damage, you will remove one of the attack cards from the initiative track. When all cards are removed from the initiative track, that boss is defeated. And I really like that system. So before we finish the video, let me go through the 3 things we liked and the 3 things that we didn't like. But this time I will have to do something different. I will talk about 1 thing we liked and 1 thing we didn't like, and you will understand why when I go through them. So the first thing we liked is the combat. Because it's very simple to learn, the enemies are not bullet sponges, the combat is really dynamic, and the player's abilities and the initiative track works really well. But the first thing we didn't like is the fact that during a chapter, you will be facing the same enemies over 5 or 6 dungeons. And like I said, each dungeon takes around an hour, so it gets very repetitive because you'll be fighting the same monsters over and over. The second thing we liked is how you build your dungeons. The fact that you build corridors and rooms as you explore, and that they have events that make them different every time you play, it's pretty cool. But the second thing we didn't like is the fact that when you start the game, you don't have enough variety in random events, and it feels like you are playing the same rooms over and over and you have the same modifiers applied all the time over and over too. And the third thing we like is the fact that each chapter gives you options which branches, and you can make decisions which will open a branch and lock another one. That and the choices that you make as a team is something I really liked. But the third thing we didn't like is the fact that each chapter takes too long to finish. If you compare with other dungeon crawl board games out there that have campaigns, the chapter is usually a dungeon that will take you around an hour and a half or 2 hours to finish, and you have to make choices either before you go to the dungeon or at the end of the dungeon. Besides that, the first chapter have a very generic type of RPG story, so it doesn't entice you right away. So to summarize, Bardsung mechanics were mostly well thought and in line with some other critically acclaimed dungeon crawl games. But how they solve variation and how they introduce the variation in the beginning of the game lacks a lot, because it seems that they intended that the variations in terms of events and enemies come later in the game. And unless you are a hardcore board gamer, you might not stick around for that long. So I wish they had a better balancing and ramp-up curve on the initial chapters, maybe having just the first 2 with 1 or 2 encounters and some simple choices with more enemy variations so that you hook up the players. And then later on, when the story develops, players are already hooked, and the chapters can have more encounters and become more dense since everyone already invested a lot in the game. I would say that if you are looking for a new dungeon crawl that has good combat and some innovative mechanics, but you are okay with a slower start, I would recommend buying it. I'm curious to hear from you guys if this board game would be for you. Like, are you okay with the slow ramp up, and would you be okay going through the several hours in the first campaigns with a small variation of enemies? Let us know in the comments, and I wish you all have a great day. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.